First song is number 72 in our supplement, number 72, Opening Prayer.
We are in Numbers chapter 21 this morning. Numbers, the 21st chapter. We'll try to review just a tad here to try to get some context. It is good to be with you this morning. So where we ended last time in Numbers chapter 21, hang on 1 minute. There we go. In Numbers chapter 21, we talked quite a bit about the bronze serpent and that whole incident with the second generation. And so let's talk just a little bit. When you look at the book of Numbers, what's the difference in this first and second generation that we see so far? I know it's early. Numbers.
The first generation initially were obedient to God. They followed God's commands. Over, they began to murmur, and that's when God condemned them to die in the desert.
Right.
And then the second generation was the generation that's going to go into the kingdom.
Right. So when you look at that first generation, as Mike mentioned, they did start out very well. Those first 10 chapters, they were in one location. God gave them the pattern. They could follow the pattern, and they did follow the pattern. But as they began to move, of course, murmuring and complaining is where it began. And what did God call their murmuring and complaining? Unbelief, very having an evil heart, unbelief. And so they're complaining, and that just manifests a spirit and an attitude of rebellion and ingratitude and lack of thanksgiving. And we see all kinds of rebellion. Of course, you remember the incident of Korah eventually, and his associates and the earth swallowing them up and the fire coming down on others and judgment and that kind of thing. Okay, so we had that, but then the second generation comes on the scene. Now, as we saw with the bronze serpent, the second generation had its problems too. They said some of the same types of things the first generation had said, but their attitude was certainly one of penitence and repentance and having a heart that was seeking that Moses offer intercession for them. He did that. What we're going to see in chapter 21, and I'll just admit to you, I'm not naturally inclined to maps and geography, but if you're going to read Numbers, you're going to have to look at maps and geography a little bit. I had a Bible professor who tested a lot on maps and geography, and I remember struggling with that, and he said, "Bruce, I'm going to make you love maps and geography." He never really did, but he did help me a lot. And what I want you to see is don't worry too much about all the specific places. We're going to talk some about that. But I want us to see what's behind that, what's going on. And that is very important in God's working among his people. And we're going to see that in chapter 21. Now, I'm just going to touch on some highlights, but before you decide, oh, this is too hard, hang in there, because actually what we're going to see in chapter 21 today, in some of these places and these victories of Israel before we go on to chapter 22, is mentioned several times in the scripture, especially in the Old Testament. Even some of the specific places are mentioned because it has to do, they're getting ready to go into Canaan. There's going to be these victories, and we're going to see the power of God in that. So just know, when it looks a little technical in chapter 21, it's going to be important for us, and we'll try to pull those principles about God and what we learn from God out of that. This is a map that if you're in the back, you probably can't see, so shame on you for sitting in the back. No, I apologize. But we'll look at some other maps. But what we're going to see, okay, so we've been talking about Mount Hor and all of that. They're going to end up going northeast, you may say. Now remember with Edom, of course, the people of Edom, who did they come from? Esau, right? We talked about Jacob and Esau. And Edom won't allow them to pass through their territory. Israel says, hey, we're not going to take advantage of the situation. We just need access through this. And what does Edom say? Well, they say, you can't come through here. Okay, what does God tell Israel to do with Edom? Did they fight? No. You know, there sometimes is the idea that God just hated all other peoples and Israel was always fighting. But we have a couple of examples in Numbers, even Numbers, when they went around. They tried not to have that fight in every situation unless there was a purpose, okay? But this time they're going to have to fight as they move northeast eventually with Sidon and Og, and we're going to look at some of that. So they're going to be moving northeast. What happened at Mount Hor? Anybody remember? Any names pop up in your mind? Yeah, Aaron. You had Miriam, and then Aaron goes up on Mount Hor, and he is stripped of his garments because of the rebellion he had been involved in. Moses' consequences will come later, and of course, who was going to take over as high priest? Eleazar, which was his son. Okay, remember that? All right, so we're looking at this area right here. They're going to go northeast. What happens at Mount Nebo later on? Anybody? Go ahead, Kelton.
Moses gets to see the land.
Okay, so if we can look at the map here for just a minute, this takes us more north, but Mount Nebo is right here. You can see they're going to hit Jericho pretty quick when they go into Canaan. So he's able to see over, but Moses won't be able to go in. So he can look there, but he will not be able to go in. Later on, we'll learn in chapter 25, Mount Peor, there's some things that happen there that anger God. But they're going to have to go on, you can see almost parallel to the King's Highway here. They're going to go northeast, and they're going to be involved in some battles, and these battles are really going to be important. They're going to go all the way to Bashan, and they're going to be victorious there. Okay, having said that, let's move on, and I'll just mention a few things to you here. We're going to read about Heshbon. They're going to go to Edrei. This is where they're going to have the battle. Then we're going to start reading about Mount Nebo. This puts them in perfect proximity to enter Canaan. That's all I want you to remember. Just that they're in proximity to enter Canaan. So when you see some of these names and that kind of thing, that'll be important. So let's read from chapter 21. I just want to mention a couple of verses here, and you can read more to get some locations, and if you're into that, you can get the map out and you'll see how important it is. So in before verse 21 actually, if you look at verse 10, he kind of gives an itinerary. Now let me tell you this, I gave you a lot more notes this morning than we're going to actually go into all the details, but you have it, okay? there is a reason, when you're reading through Numbers and you kind of get into these itineraries, they went from this place to that place and that kind of thing. When you read that, you can kind of get lost in it, and some people go, oh, this is what I, worried about with Numbers. But again, I want to emphasize to you, there's a broader reason for that, okay? So we have a little bit of an itinerary, and we'll talk about what we learn about God from that. Now, chapter 33, it's much more specific in that itinerary. But this isn't just so you'll know where they went. It's so you'll know what God is doing. Where are they heading? They're heading to the promised land. He's giving them victory. So when I see that, I say, hey, God's giving them victories, monumental victories, even for the peoples around. And we'll give you some examples of that. This is mentioned. Well, why would he mention these specific places? Because of what happened at these places. Not just so we'll have some memory work to do when we go through Numbers. Okay. With that in mind, we're going to move on. So we've talked about the itinerary. Let me mention just a few places if I can. There's a couple of stopping places that are highlighted. The first was at the Arnon River. You can see that on the map. It runs east and west. But see, that is between Moab and the Amorites. They're actually conquering these places. Now, there is a book that is referenced in Numbers 21:14 that some people will bring up, and it's called the Book of the Wars of the Lord. What's the Book of the Wars of the Lord without reading that slide? Anybody? Your favorite question in Bible class on Sunday morning? Book about wars. Yeah, it's a book about wars, man. So that's all we really know. Probably some kind of historical reference to the victorious wars, which we can read about in the Old Testament, of God's people. Okay, so why would you want that kind of record? To encourage God's people, to know that God is with them. So there's some section referenced there in 21:14, and he says that's where this is from. Now they're kind of poetic, so let's look at it. Look at verse 14, for instance. He says, therefore it is said in the book of the wars of the Lord, Wahib in Suphah, and the wadis of the Arnon, and the slope of the wadis. And he goes on to say that it extends to the side of Ar and leans to the border of Moab. From there they continued to Beer, and this is the well where the Lord said to Moses, assemble the people that I may give them water. Now what's he emphasizing? God's provisions. So he's looking at location, but he's saying location matters because of what God did. All right? You need to remember. Your children need to remember this. Verse 17, then Israel sang this song, spring up, O well, sing to it. The well which the leaders sank, which the nobles of the people dug, which with the scepter and with the staffs. And from the wilderness, he goes on to say, they continued to Mattanah. And he goes to these other places. He mentions at the top of Pisgah, which overlooks the wasteland. Okay, so why is that in there? Because he's reminding them of God's grace and God's provision and God's mercy. Okay, we're going to move on. Sorry, we're going to really get it here. All right, so the passage ends with the people east of the Jordan, north of the Dead Sea, encamped near Pisgah, which probably refers to Mount Nebo and that mountain range. This is some famous territory. So, of course, just a couple of things to remember. Balak, and we'll get to that later, but Balak would bring Balaam to Pisgah. This is really ironic, to try to get him to curse Israel. But he ends up blessing Israel. This is where Moses ends up being when he looks over into Canaan. And this is where the Israelites are going to remain until their entry into Canaan. Now, think about it from this standpoint. It's interesting with Balak and Balaam trying to get him to curse Israel, and this seems to be the very kind of entry, generally speaking, entry point where they're going to go into this blessed land. And even when Balak wants Balaam to curse them, what does Balaam end up doing? Blessing them, because that's what God wanted them to be. And that takes us all the way back to Genesis 12, where he says, I'm going to bless you. Abraham's lineage is going to be blessed. Okay, so I want to emphasize here, let's look at chapter 21, and let's look at verse verses 21 through 26. Tyler, could you read that for me, please?
Then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, "Let me pass through your land. We will not turn off into field or vineyard. We will not drink water from wells. We will go by the king's highway until we have passed through your border." But Sihon would not permit Israel to pass through his border. So Sihon gathered his people and went out against Israel in the wilderness, and came to Jahaz and fought against Israel. Then Israel struck him with the edge of the sword and took possession of his land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, as far as the sons of Ammon. For the border of the sons of Ammon was Jazer. Israel took all these cities, and Israel lived in all these cities of the Amorites, in Heshbon, and in all her villages. For Heshbon was the city of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who had fought against the former king of Moab, and had taken all his land out of his hand, as far as the Arnon.
Very good, thank you. Mike, read, if you would, verses 27 through 31.
Therefore, those who speak in Proverbs say, "Come to Heshbon, let it be built, let the city of Sihon be repaired. For fire went out from Heshbon, a flame from the city of Sihon. It consumed Ar of Moab, the lords of the heights of the Arnon. Woe to you, Moab, you have perished. O people of Shemshosh, he has given his sons as fugitives, and his daughters into captivity, to Sihon, king of the Amorites. But we have shot at them. Heshbon has perished as far as Dibon. Then we laid waste as far as Nopah, which reaches to Medeba. Thus Israel dwelt in the land of the Amorites.
Very good. Moses, verse 32, sent to spy out Jazer, and they captured its villages and dispossessed the Amorites who were there. Now, this is interesting. Remember that first generation? And he actually did it for them. I mean, God knew what was over there, and what he had told them was over there. But you find out in Deuteronomy that he did it for their assurance. So they go over there with the spies. 10 come back and say, this doesn't look good. So he sends them over there to assure them, go ahead, I'll be with you. And then they get over there and they're unbelieving. Now we have Joshua and Caleb, and they saw the same area, but because they trust God, they said, let's go. Then what happened? After he said, no, you can't go and you're going to have these consequences, you're going to die in the wilderness. Then what did they try to do? Go in there. So they wouldn't go with God. They end up trying to go there without God. And he said, if you go, you're going to die. And it didn't go well for them. Okay. This group, in contrast to that generation, Moses sent them to spy out this area. They go, and they end up capturing the villages and dispossessing the Amorites who were there. This is all very important strategically in going to Canaan. Then he says in verse 33, and remember that map as they go northeast, then they turned and they went up by the way of Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, went out with all the people for battle at Edrei. But the Lord said to Moses, do not fear him, for I have given him into your hand, and all his people and his land, and you shall do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon. Remember that map? They're just moving northeast. He says, I'll be with you. Do exactly what I'm telling you. So they killed him and his sons and all his people until there was no remnant left, and they possessed this land. So, how important is this for Israel to know and to think about? God's with them. Victory. So if he's victoriously with you in these situations, then is he going to be victorious with you as you move to Canaan? Yeah, see, this is all for Israel to, I think, to embolden their faith and to embolden their courage against those who were enemies of God. So Sihon, who's the Amorites' king, he refuses the request, and we talked about that. Let's move on. So this mention of Heshbon describes how Sihon had recently taken over much of the land from Moab. So if you look at 21 and verse 26, why is that there? Well, this poetry is showing us what had happened. Look at verse 27. Therefore, those who use Proverbs say, come to Heshbon, let it be built. So let a city of Sihon be established. For a fire went forth from Heshbon, a flame from the town of Sihon. It devoured Ar of Moab, the dominant heights of the Arnon. Woe to you, O Moab, you are ruined, O people of Chemosh. Who's Chemosh? Their God, that's right. So this will become important as well when we talk about Balaam and Balak. So there was an attitude that whatever a people's God was, now we know Yahweh, the God of Israel, is the God of all. But the pagans would think, okay, you have a God of this people, and he kind of reigns in this jurisdiction, if you will. So when a people were defeated, they viewed that God had been defeated. So you have Chemosh, and he says that basically when they were defeated, he's been defeated. Look, he has given his sons as fugitives and his daughters into captivity to an Amorite king, Sihon. But we have cast them down. Heshbon is ruined as far as Dibon. Then we have laid waste even to Nophah, which reaches to Medeba. Now, so Israel is conquering these areas. So if you're in these areas and you have Sihon who had conquered this area, but Israel comes in and they overcome him, what does that say about Yahweh? See, so really, all of this language here, when you get behind it and you say, okay, this is about who our God is. This is for Israel to know that he is victorious. It becomes quite important, I think. And so we have this poem that indicates what has happened. Now, we mentioned Chemosh was the national god of the Moabites. In fact, in Jeremiah, he calls them the people of Chemosh. That particular God is mentioned 7 times in the Old Testament, and we will read in 1 Kings that Solomon built a temple to Chemosh, but Josiah deals with that. Remember, Josiah was trying to help the people be restored. So there's a lot of Old Testament history surrounding some of the things that we are talking about. So the Israelites have taken over the Amorites' territory in this region. And after taking even further Amorite territory in 2132, they engage Og, king of Bashan, a region east and northeast of the Sea of Galilee. Now, again, I hate to bring up the map again, but if you're conquering all this area, and now you're going to go into Canaan, you can see how God is very strategic in his plans for Israel. And notice what the Lord says in 21:34, do not fear. And this is the key, and Ronnie mentioned this. For I am with you. Now, as you progress, he says to Israel, you need to do something. And I think this is important for us. If we're going to be victorious moving forward, what did they need to do? They needed to remember the past. And sometimes when God blesses us, we tend to forget it pretty quickly. And that's been a problem for Israel. I mean, they even, remember with the first generation and even with Korah in them, not only did they not remember the past, they twisted it. They distorted it to fit what they wanted in their rebellion against Moses. And so they had a distorted view. I mean, when they got done, Egypt was like paradise, and serving God now and journeying was the prison rather than the other way around. And so he's saying, just as I was with you before, I'll be with you again. And I would mention to you that as you move through the Old Testament, that's why history matters. It's not, just to know it. And you think about what happens even in our worship. When we take the Lord's Supper, what are we doing? We're remembering the past. It comes to the present for us, and then it takes us forward to the future, because as we partake of the Lord's Supper, we remember him until he what? Until he comes again. So we're in the present, we're kind of in that in-between area, but we remember the past, we look to victory in the future. So really there's a sense in which I think the Old Testament in Israel gives us a foreshadowing of what will lead us to victory, which is remembering God's deliverance in the past and His grace and His faithfulness, and how that impacts us in the decisions we make now. Israel's making decisions now, but they're not in a vacuum. They're not isolated from the past, and they lead us to the future. And if I forget about God's deliverance and grace toward me in the past, then I'm not going to move forward in the future in the way that I really need to with the victory that God has in mind for us. So he says, do not fear. Interestingly, this territory is going to be given to Manasseh. It's actually going to be given to some of God's people. Yeah, go ahead.
Typically, if a people, like they were transitioning or had transitioned from an agrarian society to a warring society, typically the way you do that would be all this training and
Yeah.
everybody would, and they did have captains, warriors and all, but we don't really read about a lot of that. What we read about is them relying on God, and of course Jericho was a great example of this. Their means of battle are going to be unconventional with God
Yes.
versus your typical warring nation. I think there is an element of structure and I assume there was some training. You would have to assume, I would think, but it was different. It was very different.
It's go all the way back to the beginning of Numbers. So remember we talked about God's pattern and even the tabernacle. And when you looked at other nations, the area of worship often was a very kingly, priestly place. But the one whose presence is there in the tabernacle is who? God. So even then, he's beginning just in that organization to teach this lesson that if you remain holy and submit to God, He's your king. He will lead you into this. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't any kind of, discipline or training. I agree with that. But you're right, very unconventional from the standpoint of the nations around them, but the victory is undeniable. So that's right. That's a good point. Now, when you get to Numbers 21, and really it should be 21 through 35, he reveals these victories that are going to encourage them, all right? So now they are in striking distance. So they're just moving strategically exactly. Now, if the first generation had been faithful, they wouldn't have gone in circles for 38 years, right? So, this is not a long trek here, really. So now, once they're on the right page, they're moving. They're going, and God is blessing them with that victory. So what I'd like to do is you go, okay, why spend all this time on this? And I think we've answered that. But I want to show you something in the Old Testament that's interesting. And whenever something shows up once, it's important. But when it keeps showing up, then we need to spend some time on it. And it would be, from our standpoint, pretty easy. We're like, I want to talk about Balaam and Balak, and let's jettison this section. Let's not. Because I want to point out some passages to you. So let's look at Joshua chapter 2 in verses 9 through 11. We're going to hit some verses here. Joshua 2, and let's get what Rahab, we know the general tone of what she said, but let's look at what she actually says. Joshua 2. And let's look. We're going to look at several passages. But let's read Joshua 2 in verses, I'll tell you what, let's read verses 8 through 11. Joshua chapter 2. Bo, could you get that for me? Joshua 2, 8 through 11.
Now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who are on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven, above and on earth beneath.
Boy, if you needed a passage to explain to you why this section would matter, that would be it. So it's not just Israel. It's all these nations around, and Rahab says, look, we've heard about that. And notice some of the language about knowing God. I know that the Lord has given you that. I know that Yahweh has given you that land. And then she goes on to say, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea. So that goes all the way back to their past deliverance when you came out of Egypt, came out of slavery, and what you did to these two kings, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And when we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. But here's the why. For the Lord your God, Yahweh your God, he is God in heaven and above and on earth beneath. He's not just the God of a particular area. Your God did this. So you can see why that would matter. But let's go even further. Let's go further with some other passages. So these are impactful affirmations about God's faithfulness. We won't read all of it, but I'll mention to you it's recounted in Deuteronomy, of course, 2, Judges 11, 19 through 21. Details are recounted about who these kings were because they were recognized, they were renowned, and then Israel overcomes them. And I think that does go to some of what Alan was saying is you're not talking about, men that had been long known as, renowned military soldiers. You're talking about God taking a very agrarian society and giving them mighty victories and them doing what he asked. So, kind of leads us back to the thought of, well, am I equipped to do this? Well, if God calls his people to do a thing, he always equips them by his grace to do that thing. He doesn't ask us to do something and us not have the ability to do that. But look at Nehemiah. I want to turn to Nehemiah, and let's look at chapter 9. Let's look at Nehemiah. Now, we won't read this. It's a long, pretty long section here in Nehemiah. But I want you to notice, we can get there. Nehemiah chapter 9 and this particular section. Now there's a long section there, verses 19 through 31. But in that section, this is what he says. He says, he's encouraging them to know that God is true to his promise. He says, you also gave them kingdoms and peoples and allotted them to them as a boundary. They took possession of the land of Sihon, the king of Heshbon, and the land of Og, the king of Bashan, and you brought them into the land which you had told their fathers to enter and possess. What's his big point there? God's power and God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness. Let's look at Psalms, though. You mean this shows up in Psalms? Yeah, it shows up in Psalms. Let's look at Psalm 135. Psalm 135. The 135th Psalm. And let's notice verse 5. He says, for I know that the Lord is great, and that our Lord is above all gods. Whatever the Lord pleases, he does, in heaven and in earth, in the seas and in all the deeps. He causes the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth, who makes lightnings for the rain, who brings forth the wind from his treasuries. He smote the firstborn of Egypt, both the man and beast. He sent signs and wonders into your midst, O Egypt, upon Pharaoh and all his servants. He smote many nations and slew mighty kings, Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan, and all the kingdoms of Canaan. and he gave their land as a heritage. And he goes on to say, your name, O Lord, is everlasting. Your remembrance, O Lord. Get that? We were talking about that. Your remembrance, O Lord, throughout all generations. For the Lord will judge his people and will have compassion on his servants. The idols of the nations are but silver and gold, the work of man's hands. They have mouths, but they do not speak. They have eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear. Nor is there any breath in all their mouths. Those who make them will be like them. Boy, that's a powerful statement, isn't it? Those who make them will be like them. So rather than being transformed into the image of the transcendent God, the true and the living God. If your idol is motivated by fleshly lust, it's because you're following your fleshly lust. And you know, one of the interesting things about that is when you're ignorant of God's history, you get to make God who you want him to be. And so we live in a time when there's a lot of people, whatever I emotionally want, whatever I want to do, however I want to worship, however I want to live, that's what God, because God wants me to be happy, which usually doesn't mean true fulfillment in a spiritual sense. It means I do what I want to do. Now, there's several things that lead to that. One is being driven by my desires rather than God's, but I'll tell you something else is not knowing the true and the living God and who he is. So I get to build my own view of the history of God. But see, as a Christian, I go back, and this is the point in all of this. These victories were more about God than anything else. And so the psalmist would say, remember what God did and who he is. Don't serve those idols. Serve the true and the living God. And the more you know about him and the more you know about how he works and who he is, the more you'll be like him. And you'll run away from that idolatry. Does anybody have a comment or a question? Go ahead, Al.
Well, if you're going to go there, Joshua is recounting to Israel the history of the peace, and Joshua 24, verse 11. And I gave them some of the Amorites, and I sent a hornet before you, which drove them out before you to the Amorites.
There it is.
If you've ever been attacked by hornets,
Yeah.
yellow jackets or something like
Yeah.
that, I mean, that just totally disrupts everything that you've got going. That becomes your sole focus from there.
That's a good point. Yeah,
God sent them against the enemies of Israel.
that's right. That's right. Anybody else want to make any comment? Go ahead, Tom.
Just to add to all that, I was sitting there thinking about, God brought this people out of Egypt. They were slaves.
Yeah.
There was no military training whatsoever.
Yeah.
As slaves, you're just a slave, you're a servant, you're just doing what you're told. But they come out, no military background. It really shows how God's with them and how it's God that's seen them through everything.
Right.
Their victories.
Right. And you know, the history should have been something that removed any thought of arrogance. And yet that we know that becomes a problem, but it would have removed any, look at our status. It should have been, look at our God. And I think that's what this historical reference in this chapter, when you back away and you look at these other places where it's used, you go, oh, this is a bigger deal. Go ahead, Mark.
The map, and you feed this into Syria and ask, let's go from Egypt to Canaan, just go straight up the coast. So maybe the Israelites wondered, why are we going on the far side of the Jordan and so forth? Yet now we see God use these victories to teach his people, and as well, Rahab shows, the people of Canaan were learning as well. So sometimes we expect God to go in our lives from point A to point B, and we're over here on the east side of Jordan. We're like, Lord, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
The Lord knows what he's doing, and he has some purposes in the things that are happening.
Right.
Just because God doesn't do things the way the app on your phone says, doesn't necessarily mean God doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah,
Trust
exactly.
the Lord. God has a plan, and God knows what he's doing. We just want to trust the Lord and stay with him.
Let's look at what Mark is saying right now. So, for instance, this is a more northern kind of section of that map. This is Mount Nebo, right? And in chapter 25, we're going to be talking about this area. Go way up here, that's right. And that's a great application point, I think. Thanks for that. That's good. We do tend to want to go from A to B, and if we don't go to A to B, we think, okay, God said no, or what's going on? That's right. But he always has his purposes. And apparently this was a very important purpose from a strategic standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint, from the standpoint of their covenant with God, and even for other peoples, because Rahab ends up, asking for God's mercy toward her, Yahweh, to be merciful toward her. One more passage, and then we'll stop. By the way, I'll go ahead and put all my cards out on the table. I am super excited about Balaam and Balak. Okay, not just because a donkey talked either. So I will tell you, it's the irony is great that a man that was supposed to be a seer and a prophet and a diviner is taught by his donkey. And I'll just let that kind of lie right there. Okay. I do want to look at Psalms 136 just quickly, and then we'll stop here. Let me get back way over here. Psalms 136, though, you can go ahead and it does the same thing. If you look at Psalms 136, and this is what I want us to see, is that this helps us know who God is. Numbers helps us know who God is by what he does. And the Jews understood, how do I know who God is? Well, I can talk about his attributes, but I look at what he does. And so it's important for us to know that. But look at the beginning. This is a thanksgiving to the Lord for verse 1, for he is good, his loving kindness, his steadfast love, his loyal love, his faithful love is everlasting. And he talks about his, the creation of God, and he goes back through history. Look at verse 10, very similar to Psalms 135. He brought out Israel from Egypt. But again, look at these affirmations. His loving kindness is everlasting. Well, how do we know that? Because of what he does. His strong hand and an outstretched arm, for his loving kindness is everlasting. To him who divided the Red Sea, his loving kindness is everlasting. He made Israel pass through the midst of it. His loving kindness is everlasting. He keeps saying this about who God is based on what God did. And then look, he says, to him who led his people through the wilderness, his loving kindness is everlasting. I mean, I love this section because he helps us know how to read the Old Testament, how to read the Bible. He says he smote great kings. His loving kindness, his faithful love is everlasting. He slew mighty kings. And then he even mentions Sihon, king of the Amorites. What does that prove to his people? What does that prove to his people? His faithful love is everlasting. And Og, king of Bashan. So, look at verse 23. What does that tell us? Who remembered us in our low estate and has rescued us from our adversaries. Who gives food to all flesh, giving thanks to the God of heaven. What does this tell us? If he did it then, he will do it now. And he'll help us to walk in his loving kindness. These aren't just cities and places on a map. They are on a map, and they are cities and places. But they are events that tell us that our God is indeed a God of steadfast